Um, Welcome everyone. This is the Polling Principle podcast. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about AI and biology and drug discovery. And I'm here with my friend Dan. And hopefully we'll have a nice conversation.
We'll learn a little bit more about longevity and biology.
hmm So I think we can probably skip intros. Anybody that's going to be listening to this podcast already knows about polling and so on. So you know, what are we going to talk about that?
Yeah, let's totally talk about Pauling. Why don't we just kick it off? Like, where did Pauling start? What's why the name, and just give like a quick rundown on where we're at.
Yeah. So the company is actually named after Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling was an American chemist. He did amazing work. He is one of a few people that won two Nobel Prizes. He won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and then later he won the Nobel Prize in the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's a small club. I think there's five people in history that have ever won two Nobel Prizes. But it's most commonly known for his discovery of the chemical bond, right? Which
Yeah,
is one of the central things in chemistry, like what actually ties molecules together. And um, he also started a lot of the work on trying to understand the connection between molecules and their structure. So essentially, how the structure of a molecule determines its function. He started building physical models, like actual, models with, metal, balls and links and so on and so forth. He was very close to actually discovering the structure of DNA, right? Which is what like Francis and Crick, would later want to discover. He didn't really quite got there, right? But he discovered a lot of other structures in proteins, for example, like the fact that amino acids sometimes roll over into what is called alpha helices, or sometimes they create kind of flat structures, which are called beta sheets. So he was one of the first people that actually came up with a lot of the stuff that determine how we understand proteins and how they actually behave.
that's a very so it sounds like a very deep history in terms of why you're intertwined. But how does that? So based on that, how are you intertwining that into longevity now, right? And so
Yeah.
how did that whole come? Because it seems like there's this interesting history in the background that you're talking about. What the early stages of when he was building what chemicals look like, trying to model all that out. But, taking all of that, how was the actual Pauling now it's AI, it's for 20 what year was that actually that he discovered or started this?
Oh, goodness, like, that was the 30s and 40s.
Okay, so pre-World War II, right? We're in
Mhm.
2025 now. AI is like the big next thing, and, everyone's trying to essentially get AI or machine learning into their world of some sort. What are you doing with the specific thing that Pauling was doing back then and now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so, like, the fact that the company is named after him, right? Like, doesn't mean that it ties into it, right? Like, a lot of the stuff that was done then is just foundational.
Yeah.
Uh,
People have been trying to figure out how to live longer for many, many, years. So like this is literally the first, human instinct, right? Like the very oldest um novel, if you call it like that, so to speak, was the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? It's the oldest story that has been kept in writing, right? This is older than the Old Testament and the Bible and so on, right? And it basically tells a story about this king that wanted to live forever, right? And goes into this epic quest, trying to figure out how to do that. So humans have been looking into this for centuries, right? The thing is, for the vast majority of history, we had no idea how to approach that. Like people may have thought that they had any idea, but they really didn't, right? Like the understanding was just not that enough. Now there were a whole bunch of things that happened over the past century, right? We started understanding things like the structure of molecules. We started understanding the entirety of the human genome, right? Like we know that genes are translated into proteins, and the proteins perform functions. So if we understand, what those genes are, the entire sequence of those genes, we know, in theory, we could know the entire structure of those proteins. We could know the entire behavior of a full biological system, right? So now there's quite a bit of understanding of the fundamental concepts of biology, right? And on the other hand, uh, people have discovered many different mechanisms of tuning or tweaking a little bit how aging works. So in animals, we know this. We know how to make animals live longer, like 6 weeks to 7 days, right? Like there's calorie restriction, there all sorts of small molecules, there's gene therapies, and so on and so forth, right? So there are many things that have been tried, and we know they work, right? Like if you take rapamycin, for example, is a drug that is sometimes used for something unrelated. You give it to worms, the worms live longer. You give it to flies, the flies live longer. You give it to mouse, the mouse lives longer, and so on and so forth, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, it stands to reason that you give it to humans, probably humans would live longer, right? And we have a little bit of an understanding of how it actually does what it does. And there are many other mechanisms. But, aging is a very complex phenomenon that has a lot of different variations, right? So we kind of had like a scientific community, right? Had to develop a deep enough understanding how a lot of these things work to be able to come up with novel mechanisms that then were safe enough that they could taken through a clinical trial process, for demonstrating efficacy and safety, and then be able to come up as with drugs, right, that people could actually take on their day to day, to live longer. So I think we're still, we've been like people that have been interested or working in longevity. And just to put realize, like, at Pollen, we're not just building, something for longevity, we're also building a fairly general drug discovery platform. But in general, we had to build all these different steps, right? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to happen before we get to a point where we can um, get a molecule that is demonstrably efficacious, preventing, some aspect of aging, right? And helps people live longer.
Yeah.
So we're still, early phases, right? But the really exciting thing about it, right, is like now we do know enough, right, to be able to say, okay, if we actually were able to do this, right, like we could get that effect, right? Whereas even just 50 years ago, this would have been a crazy dream.
Yeah. It seems like we've come a long way, back in the 1600s, the explorers were looking for the fountain of youth. And then, back in, let's go 30, 40 years ago, we are testing things on monkeys, right? And it's the inhumane. And so it seems like drug discovery, and in general, the ability for us to actually look at compounds and test them essentially is what Pauling's doing, is right. They're creating a way for us to look at how do we discover new drugs and how do those interact with other molecules.
Well, so maybe let me talk a little bit about, in general, how the drug discovery process works and
Yeah.
how things, behave. So the traditional way of coming up with a drug was, you find something in nature, some phenomena, and then you try to understand it and then try to apply it into something else, right? But we typically would find things in nature and then bring them on to be used as drugs. So, many years ago, people looked at, the willow bark tree, for example, and then they realized, okay, there's some resin or whatever, you can extract it, you can take it, and that alleviates pain. And then eventually, folks isolated the uh, acetylsalicylic acid, right, which is the ingredient in aspirin, and that's how aspirin was found, right? Honestly, it was the same study with rapamycin, for example. Somebody was in I don't remember the name of the person. They were in Rapa Nui. They found this compound that was supposed to have some anti microbial effect, and then they isolated. They were sitting on it for many years. Like it was literally discovered. I don't know, it was like the 50s or the 60s, right? It was sitting there for many years. Eventually, somebody found out that it had some immunosuppressant properties, and it was just for something else, and so on and so forth. But it wasn't something that was designed from scratch. It wasn't a compound where we went and tried to apply it in engineering mindset. It was mostly a discovery process. So the way that those things were developed is people would go and do experiments or try to test if these molecules have a useful effect, right? So in the case of pain, for example, it maybe a little bit easier, right? So people that have pain, just get them, give them this drug, do they feel less pain or not, right?
On a scale of 1 to 10, right?
Yeah. I mean, now it's not in scope, right? I mean, pain is still very hard to quantify. Um,
Yeah.
there are ways to do it, right? Like, whereas longevity is a little bit harder, right? Because you
Right.
can't, just go and give somebody some drug for 20 years and then decide, well, how young do you feel today? Right? It's a little bit harder to do. Now, there's a lot of people working on these things called aging clocks that kind of try to measure aging, but it's still not obvious. So, um, so that was the traditional way of doing things, right? And then folks came up with what's called rational drug design. And this stems from the fact that now we have this understanding of biology and structures. So, here's the way that a lot of drugs work. If you have a protein, like proteins sometimes have little crevices where you can fit other molecules. So, if you have a molecule where you want to inhibit or you want to prevent from doing something, you can fit a small molecule inside, and then that would bind to it somehow and then prevent it from working. So, for example, something that you know I mention a lot of times, right? When I talk to people, because it's very easy to understand. So imagine that you have penicillin. Penicillin is an antibiotic. So you use it to prevent certain types of bacterial infections. The way this works is you have bacteria, and then the bacteria are just hanging out, eating, like doing their thing. And then what they do is they have a wall, which is basically kind of molecules outside of it that prevents the immune system from penetrating it. And that wall is basically proteins and then little glycans attached to them, right? Like sugars, sugar molecules of different types. So they have a protein inside, which is called an enzyme, that kind of catalyzes a reaction, which is another way to say it performs a function where it attaches molecules together. So what that protein does is it takes the cell and the glycans in the bacterial wall and then it builds them. So it's basically the protein that builds the defenses of the bacteria. So when you take penicillin is a small molecule that goes ahead and enters the bacteria. It goes all over the body. That's all sorts of random things, but eventually it comes into a bacteria, and then it binds to this protein and prevents the protein from working. So then the bacteria just cannot build that wall. It cannot build the wall, so it has only the regular membrane. Then the immune system comes in and then heats it up, and that's it. End of the bacteria. So this is an antibiotic, right? It was very, very important, right? It saved many people throughout all sorts of bacterial infections. Of course, it was discovered in the middle of the 20th century, and I think conceptually it's easy to understand that you have this mechanism, and then you basically break it by introducing a small molecule. Now, in rational drug design, we're not just like now we understand this, right? Because we can figure out how those structures look like. We understand the mechanism of action. In rational drug design, you don't have to just wait until you evaluate this phenomena to say, okay, let me use that myself. We can design things a little bit from scratch, and it's not great, and it's not really like you would design a human engineering product, but it works a little bit the same way. So what you would do is you would take a structure of a protein that you want to inhibit, which could be a protein in a macroorganism. It could be a cancer protein. It could be something else that you think, okay, this is kind of overacting. Then you look at that structure, and then you fit a small molecule, for example, right? Like those are the ones that are easier to do. You fit the small molecule in there, and then it breaks it down, and then suddenly your cancer cell stops reproducing, for example, or your microorganism stops reproducing as well, right? So that's the way that sometimes drugs are created. Now, we're not really good at this, so most drugs are still it's very, very hard go through this process. Like our scientific understanding is fairly complete, right? But now we're starting to get the capability of actually doing things like that.
Yeah. And how long does, you talked about we've come from this like rudimentary way of looking at how we were discovering drugs by taking them in their natural environment and then, essentially taking a small scientific process, expanding it, and then trying to understand how they interact with the human body. I mean, if you look at the today world of where we're in now, AI just got introduced in the last year or so. What does a typical drug discovery process even look like, and how long does it take and cost?
Yeah. So, okay, lots of questions, lots of things to
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
into. So traditionally, drug discovery, like back in the day, right, before regulations, before any of this stuff, things were a little, I don't know, like cowboy kind of way, right? So like people will spend a few years with this experiment and then call it a day, right? Now some of those compounds were grandfathered in, so to speak, right? So we just know they're generally safe, they work and whatever, but there was no like clinical trial for
Mhm.
aspirin, right? Even though
Right.
everybody had it in their closet now. Then all sorts of regulations came in. It became harder and harder and harder because the amount of evidence that was required to do these things was bigger, right? Like things people are supposed to do things more carefully, right? Also, there were a whole bunch of scandals that happened. Right? Like the most famous was this. There was this compound that people used, pregnant women would use for sickness, and then it turned out that sometimes it would change shape and it would cause this horrible birth defects. So, like thousands of babies that were born with birth defects in the middle of the 20th century. Well, that was one of the reasons why the FDA was created in the first place, to prevent something like that from happening. But even much later, there was this other drug, I think it was called Vioxx. In the 90s, it turned out that it caused, cardiotoxicity, if I remember right, and also thousands of people died unnecessarily. So even in spite of all that, it's still very, very, very hard, right? Because
Mhm.
like the community just doesn't understand it. So the regulations became fairly onerous, and now for a lot of drugs, it takes a long time to take them through approval, right? So the process, barely how it look, more or less how it looks like is, initially there's a little bit of a discovery phase. We will try to understand how the molecule works. Then after a year, a couple of years, 3 years, they eventually pick a specific shape, a specific type of molecule that they believe it works. Then they do what is called IND, or investigation on new drug introduction. It's basically a process in which somebody asks the FDA to look at a package of information to enable the company or the group to give the drug to humans. That IND process typically involves tests on animals, dogs
Mhm.
and rats and other animals. It involves checking toxicity at different dosages and so on. After that is done, and that may take another year, um, people start what's called a clinical trial. And that clinical trial is typically split into three phases. First, checking that the drug is not going to kill people. That is done on a small group of typically healthy volunteers. Then checking that it works, and that is done on a small group of patients. Then, if it's safe and efficacious, then the company or the organization does a larger phase three, which is kind of the real deal, right? Where you take a large enough number of people and then you prove that the drug actually does a better job than something else. Like normally people don't ask, does this work or not, right? Because there's the placebo effect, there's all sorts of, confounding factors, so things can be very, very tricky, right? Typically the test is not to check that something works. The the hypothesis is, does this work better than something else, better than a
Mm.
placebo, better than the standard of care, better than some other potential treatment and so on. And then if that works out, then there's a what's called an NDA uh, uh, approval. Then the drug comes to market, and then you can sell it, and hopefully cure people, right?
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, which is the most common part, right? If it doesn't work at any of those stages, then you spend tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, and you have nothing to show for it. You have to go and try again.
Yeah. And is that fairly frequent? How many recalls do you think happen in new drugs?
I don't think recalls are frequent. There are a few drugs that have been removed from the market, but what is very common is that drugs just aren't approved, that don't work, right? Or
Yeah.
they are not safe enough. So I would say 90, 95, 99% of the molecules where somebody has a little bit of an intuition, a little bit of data that they may work, they end up not working.
Yeah.
Or if like they can't show that they work well. There are lots of problems with this process, right? Stemming from the fact that it's very expensive and it's very hard. People don't do it, very well in some cases, right? So most of these searches for drugs end up failing. Yeah, one of the things that folks are very excited about is, what can we use actually AI to do this more effectively, right? And there are a lot of different ways, right, to approach that problem, right? So that are if you look backwards, you can use AI to process documentation in clinical trials faster, right? This is a problem that sometimes takes months, just going through all this, documentation. Um, you can use AI to go through all these documents and then find molecules that may have overlooked that could be used for something else. So sometimes what people do is they do a clinical trial, they measure a whole bunch of things, and then they say, okay, my trial is supposed to cure cancer. And then, it doesn't cure cancer, so you have to go ahead and scrape it, but maybe it cures something else. So, it's interesting when you can find those things. And then, um, if you walk a little bit backwards, right, like, being able to automate some of the experiments on animals, for example, I think that's very interesting, right? Because the faster and the cheaper that you can do experiments, it means the more you can do.
Yeah.
And then even before that, in the very initial stages, right, like there are a whole bunch of things a whole bunch of opportunities where you could use AI to make the process cheaper and faster, right? Which is actually, what I'm personally most excited about. Like a lot of the work in the initial phases involves going through literature research and everything that is known about a specific disease or a specific protein or specific what's called a target, right, which is the kind of thing that you want to modify in order to have an impact on that disease. And then running through hundreds, thousands, millions of different potential options for what you want to do to it, running all those experiments, evaluating those experiments, and so on and so forth. So up until very, very recently, if you wanted to do it, you had to do it by hand. You had to, had a team that was expert in the specific parts of it, that knew how to do all these things carefully. You need all these people to go through it. Now, one of the big things that is happening in the world, right, driven by language models and other AI tools, is that we have the capability to automate many of these things. So if you take the work that was done by a team of humans and you do it using a set of AI agents, and suddenly, all other things being equal, it becomes cheaper and faster, right? And eventually, I think the hope is that it would be better as well, right? Like the AI would be able to find things that humans would not be able to do. But at the very least, the one thing that we're seeing here very broadly, not just in drug discovery, but in general, is that the things that can be automated will become cheaper and will become faster and more available.
Yeah. It's interesting because it seems like this AI, you know, AI is still in its kind of its infancy and in early stages, right? We're still working this, seeing the technology built up, but it seems like this technology has so much potential to help speed up and look at old chemicals and just see the way they interact with that previously never really made it to a testing phase, right? Or never even got to interact with a human or an animal, or rightfully so. Maybe they were dangerous or unsafe, but this gives us an extra layer of saying, hey, we can go back to that chemical potentially and say, look, well, let's experiment with this in a simulated environment that isn't a human, that isn't a rat, that isn't
Yeah.
inhumane, and potentially do that at 10x the speed because we can deploy 50,000 agents who are just working through the simulation and seeing what is interacting, what isn't.
Yeah.
Um, that's cool. That's super interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I would question that it's not ready yet, right? Like things had moved so much faster. Like, I mean, maybe moving beyond drug discovery, right? Like you probably have seen this. Like, uh, these language models and AI based on language models, like they can automate things that like you needed a human for, just 2, 3 years ago, right? Like, yeah, writing marketing copy, creating websites, sending, TikTok posts, like automatically generating videos, right? With a person, talking about something, right? Like all those things, like you can literally do everything, fully automated today, right? So if you were a marketing person, right, and you go and say, look at this, technology and say, well, I mean, this could be useful if you are the person that is using it, right? But for a lot of people, it's like, well, yeah, that was the job, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think we're not very far away from self-driving cars, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was one of the things that people talked about early this year at JP Morgan, for example. Like, there were just so many Waymos driving around San Francisco. So literally, you could not, walk, for like a couple of blocks without seeing a Waymo pass by. So self-driving cars are coming, right? Like that, AI is not based on language models, right? But it's coming, it's probably just a few years away now, right? I mean, I've been saying this for the past like 7 years, but now it's finally, I think, very close. Um, and the same way, right? Like, I think a lot of these things, I think they have different timelines, right? Maybe robotics is a little bit farther away, and that's going to be a whole another kind of worms. But a lot of these things are already here, right? So things are changing faster than a lot of people grasp, right?
Yep.
Agents in software engineering, for example, they're already here, right? Like
Yeah.
you have, a lot of people um, that are using them to build apps, very, very quickly, right? And if you actually look at the implications, in terms of like the job openings for software engineers and so on and so forth, things have shifted dramatically over the past 3 years. Like during COVID, this whole spike, everybody's trying to hire software engineers, like if people work remotely very well and so on and so forth. Like there's been hundreds of thousands of positions that have been closed over the past 2 or 3 years. Right.
Yeah.
So that suggests to me that the technology is not, just up and coming, right? Like literally it is here now, right? And it is making a meaningful impact. Now, within drug discovery in particular, I think we haven't seen it yet, right? Because it's a little bit of a laggard in terms of, I think, some technology adoption, right?
Yeah.
But it will definitely happen over the next few years.
Yeah. Do you also see that polling is a good way to enable newer companies to you're saving so much money by not having to go through a lot of these like initial steps, right? This discovery research, all that, the very costly stuff we have to hire. Do you see that maybe polling this platform also enables more companies or more chemical companies to experiment with newer drugs and just to try to bring things to the market that haven't been there before?
Yeah. So maybe let me answer in a little bit of a longer way, right? So,
Yeah.
so what we're building, of course, is a platform to automate a lot of this initial drug discovery tests, right? And uh, the way that I think about it is as I mentioned, the first benefit is in being able to do the same things that we're doing now, but cheaper and faster.
Yeah.
Then, of course, what happens, second order effect from that is that if something is cheaper and faster, it becomes more available,
Mhm.
right? So, um, which I mean, that's just regular technology adoption, right? When internet originally came out, it was very expensive. You needed all this modems, right, that make noise, and like you needed a computer, and they were very expensive, and so on and so forth, right? But eventually, it becomes so cheap that everybody could adopt it, right? Same thing with cell phones, and same thing with a lot of other technologies. So, um, what does that mean in the context of drug discovery? I think what it means is that if now somebody needs to spend millions of dollars and years of work to come up with some initial evidence that a molecule can help with specific disease, that is going to become cheaper, faster, and thus more available, right? So if you have, right now, there's literally thousands of diseases for which there's basically no treatment whatsoever, right? Even though there's a little bit of an understanding of how this disease actually works. So the reason there's no treatment is because a lot of them are very rare. So there may be 1,000 people in the country that actually suffer from that disease. So if you look at it from the perspective of an entrepreneur, for example, or somebody at a large pharma company, you look at it and say, okay, curing or helping these 1,000 people, is going to bring in $5 million, right, per year, for example,
Yeah.
right? So you go and say, you know what, for $5 million, it's not worth it to spend 50 million to try to find a molecule that works. It's just too hard. The risk is too big, and even if we succeed, we will not, we're not bringing in any money, right?
Yeah.
This is actually the problem with antibiotics, and is the reason why we haven't seen a lot of antibiotics, even though in the world that we live in, a lot of bacteria are developing antibiotic resistance.
Yeah.
Which is very, very, very concerning, right? I don't want to be into the doomerism kind of side of the world, but it's very concerning. The reason we haven't seen more antibiotics is because even though some companies have come up with novel molecules that could work as antibiotics are so rare, right? Like some of these bacteria may infect 100 people a year, right? 100 people a year today, right? Maybe a million in the future, but it's 100 today, right? And then the antibiotic is, there's only so much that they can charge for it. So there's just no way to recoup that investment.
Yeah.
Now, if you suddenly change the equation and say, well, instead of 50 million, maybe you can do it for 20, or instead of a 1% probability of success, maybe it's 5%, then things change, right? So if you know that you could spend $500,000 and get a good probability of finding a molecule that is actually going to work, even if your maximum amount of money that you're going to make from a specific set of patients is 5 million a year. If you spend only 500,000, suddenly things are different, right? It's not like, oh, I need to spend 50 million and I can only get 5 million a year. Then like I would never really recover my money.
Yeah.
You spend only 500,000, you come up with something, you can get it tested properly, right, and safely, following the same standard protocols, but just being more efficient about it, then the universe of potential diseases that you can cure becomes much, much bigger, right?
Right.
So I think the real hope with a lot of these things is not just to make things cheaper for the sake of making more money, right? The real hope is that when it becomes cheaper and when it becomes faster, then the kinds of diseases that you can cure, becomes much wider. And in particular, of course, like the one that the thing that I'm mostly interested in is for many, many years, like we've discovered many of these mechanisms that affect aging that ended up not going to, the clinic, not going to trials, not being developed because you cannot make money with a longevity drug because longevity is not a disease that is approved, right? So you cannot go to the FDA and say, oh, I will have a drug that improves, um, how long somebody lives. But they will go and tell you that is not a disease that you can develop a drug for, right? So you could, in theory, run that trial, right? But then there will be no way to make money out of it, right? Because a doctor cannot legally diagnose somebody with aging.
Longevity.
And no, you cannot. Well, longevity would be a good thing, right? Aging is the bad thing. So you cannot go to the doctor and say, doctor, could you please diagnose me, with longevity, right? So I can then get my drug prescribed. Like that entire process would never work, right? Today. So you would have to like figure out other ways to make money somehow, right? Which I mean,
Yeah.
the other people are thinking about too, right? So, but part of the problem is, of course, like nobody is going to spend all this money, going that way. Now, it's very funny, like how you look at some of this Ozempic kind of drugs, right? And some of them, they're actually helping people live longer, of course, because if if somebody is like, overweight, heavily overweight, and then they lose all that weight, all their, metabolism is going to get better, right? Like, insulin, sensitivity are going to get better, the risk of diabetes, the risk of cancer, a lot of things just get better. So these drugs are effectively helping people live longer. Now, I
Well,
don't think
73% of the population is obese here in the United States, right? We know the statistics. Like there is so much in the background around that.
Yeah, but you could argue, well, it's Ozempic a longevity drug? I don't know, probably not, right? But if you go to your doctor and say, you know what, I want to take Ozempic so I can live longer, right? The doctor will be like, no, sorry, you can't.
Yeah.
Can't do that.
But it's interesting because there seems like a cross section of like longevity drugs or in general health and wellness things, right? And so like in a way that could you argue that, let's just say Ozempic is it's just a drug that helps you be healthier, right? And so in a way that it's solving a problem. Any drug that we potentially discover, let's just say somebody has a small chronic disease or a very, very small. Well, you're going back to what you were saying actually earlier, which is what I wanted to talk about was it looks like you're opening essentially it's a supply and demand thing. You're lowering the barrier to entry to essentially get a new chemical into the market and to discover something new. But this also presents an interesting area is there's a lot of diseases, a lot of sicknesses out there. And, I have a close friend of mine who died from a very rare form of cancer, right? And so to develop those drugs, in a capitalistic market where we live, it doesn't make sense. There's not enough total addressable market. And that's the way, unfortunately, some investors think, right? And so what you're doing is you're enabling those investors to say, hey, there's a smaller addressable market, but we found a solution or a platform or a tool that essentially helps us enable to be able to save more lives at a much cheaper rate. And so in not only just longevity, this is really increasing the potential us having the ability to solve small time diseases that are really rare and unique in the nature and no one has the time to solve, or cancers potentially that are just too rare for there to be massive investment because you're going to start at the biggest section of the pie and move downwards.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting point, right? A lot of cancers are actually very, very rare. Cancer is not a single disease, right? Like cancer is a collection of thousands of different diseases. And that is basically the hope, right? But maybe one interesting thing that you mentioned that is worth going a little bit deeper is there is this notion in Western medicine, right, of homeostasis, right, or a system that is in a healthy equilibrium, and then you somehow perturb that system, and then the system would kind of try to get back to equilibrium. So if you have a healthy person and that person gets infected with a bacteria, that infection, perturbs, the equilibrium, and then you give it antibiotic, the immune system kills that bacteria, and that person goes back to normality. So that's the way that most medicine works. And that is incredibly effective for a lot of different things, right? Yeah, in my mind, the most obvious one is infectious disease, which used to be the thing that killed the vast majority of humans all throughout history, right? So, you have to, it's kind of, hard for modern humans to understand the incredible impact of sanitation and antibiotics. But another way to think about it is, well, there are some things that happen not acutely over a few days, but chronically over many, many years. So, for example, somebody that overeats and eventually develops metabolic syndrome, that person is incurring a little bit of damage over many, many years. So, some of those conditions are well understood, right? Like, diabetes, whatever, but there are many other things that impact the how long that person is going to live, right? Um, so, and many of those are not really treated in modern medicine, right? Which kind of reason why some people are opting for, different types of prevention and more holistic medicine or whatever, right? Which, I think it has some merits as well. Then there is another point, which is even if you did everything absolutely perfect, um, you know, expertly designed diet, a great regime of exercise and meditation and cold plunges and everything that you could possibly imagine. There is this notion that the time that an otherwise healthy human would live is somehow, uh, limited, um, because there are other things that we still don't understand that are related to that age. So, for example, one process that we don't understand very well is called sarcopenia. Now, after about 35 years old, every decade, you lose. No, I don't think it. Yeah, I think every decade you lose about 3% of your muscle mass, right? Even if you are otherwise being healthy and walking around and doing a little bit of exercise, people would lose muscle, and that happens for a series of different things. It's not typically diagnosed unless it's something that is very very severe, but it would be considered normal aging, right? Like we kind of assume that somebody get older, they lose strength and they lose their ability to function. Uh, there are so many things that we would assume are normal, but now the really interesting part is, well, even if it has happened for all of human history, even if it's considered normal by the vast majority of the population, can we do something about it, right?
Mhm.
Can we come up with a molecule that extends the fully functioning behavior of human muscle so that we do not lose that muscle mass over the years? And this is, uh, you know, just important, right? For a variety of reasons, not just, not being strong enough, right? But like one of the reasons why people sometimes die in old age is because they sleep in the shower and they break a hip or whatever, right? Uh, or they're not able to perform independently, so they don't exercise anymore. And when they stop exercising, other health markers, go down and so on and so forth. Now, the the interesting thought, right? Like, the point where things start becoming a little, like exciting, right? Is, well, if you take enough of these things that you assumed were normal, right? Like losing muscle mass or like, the skin wrinkles, and then you accumulate, atherosclerotic plaque, in blood, things that you would assume, okay, yeah, that's just the way that aging works. And you solve enough of them through new drugs, through new interventions, then can you get a person who's otherwise healthy and live much longer, right? So what I sometimes tell people is, in my mind, the the idea, the hope would be, can we take a person to live to 150 years, right?
Mhm.
So this is it's close enough that it's not like, super crazy, right? You wouldn't say, oh yeah, 1,000 years, Well, I mean, I don't know. That's kind of,
Yeah.
hard to say. A tree can live 1,000 years, right? Mammals, not so much, right? Like we have sharks that live, 250 years and whales that live 200 years, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Tortoises.
but it's also tortoises, yeah, many of them will live, 150,
Yeah.
150 to 200 years. But for a human, I think it would be, there's no, I would find it very, very hard that you could take a human and then without uh, molecular biology and modern medicine, I don't think you could take that human to live to 150. Right, like something would end up killing that person. The oldest recorded person was 122. Like that one, people that are um, living today would have people that would live longer than 120, but 150 is far enough, right? That you would say, yeah, without uh drug discovery, without really novel scientific insight, it's going to be very, very hard to get there. But it's still close enough that you could say, well, in the first century, right? Like, would we discover new therapies that would help people, live that long, right? And then once you get to 150, right, then you can do it forward, right? Can we live to 200? Can we live to 250, right?
Yeah.
So the, it's sometimes going a little bit um the way that most people would understand life, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think that laws of physics preventing that from happening, right?
Yeah.
Again, a shark will live to 250 years, right? And we kind of assume that is normal, right? If a shark had the benefit of modern medicine, right, and diet and exercise, maybe it wouldn't be 250, maybe it would be 300 or 400 years, right? Right, like this is a shark that is living in the wild,
Yeah.
in the cold, hunting, like doing an effort every day to find enough food, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We humans, right, like like normally in the wild, 1,000 years ago, we would live, 35, 40, 50 years, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, and just from what you're saying alone, like, let's just say we developed a drug chemical that extended life by something, and then we needed to test it, like you earlier talked about. Let's say we put that into a tortoise, right, who already lives 150 years. We're like, okay, we're going to extend your life theoretically by 25%. We then have to wait another 100 and, something plus years more to make sure that we can then see, does this actually work? So we have a need to speed up discovery because
Yeah.
there's no other way. Like, this has to be done as fast as possible so then we can improve it now and at least have to use it in our relative lifetimes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the traditional way of testing some of these things is not going to work. I think in some ways, maybe it's a good thing that aging is not really considered a disease, right? Because if you had to test for longevity by checking if the organism actually lives longer, then it would never happen. It would never happen. Nobody's going to wait, 25 years, right, to do a clinical trial.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's safe to say that we both consider aging a disease because we probably work out, we take care of your
Yeah.
body, and you try to eat healthy things. So I think over time, I do think that, we're seeing society is changing. Look at people are drinking less alcohol because we know that alcohol can impact aging. It can impact and increase your chances of cancer, of
Yeah.
diseases of any sort. And so I think you're seeing a shift in the younger population that's moving towards, hey, we want to be healthier. Healthier means what? Increasing the lifespan that you're potentially going to live.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Well,
think people are definitely more open to those ideas now, right, than even just like, a couple of days ago.
yeah. Well, I think Pauling's first step when it comes to, when you get a little bit bigger and you have a big lobbying arm, hopefully maybe you start lobbying that aging is a disease that we can,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Well, hey, I'll do a call out. So there's this organization that I like very much. It's called the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives.
Yeah.
And they're basically a lobbying organization to promote research on longevity. So there's already somebody doing that. They're run by somebody called Dylan. Who's a fantastic guy. He's been working on this for many years, right? And so lending love that way.
Yeah, totally. Well, looks like someone else is already doing it. Hopefully it'll be a disease that we,
We need more. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like this is literally just a starting, right? Like
Yeah.
there's so few people working on this type of things, right? But just one of the things that sometimes, drives me crazy, right? Like you have yeah, I mean, I don't want to, criticize somebody else, right? But like, you have people spending billions of dollars, like going to concerts, right? And then you go and say, well, why couldn't we just spend those billions of dollars finding longevity tracks so that everybody in the world could get a few years of extra life? Like, wouldn't that be more valuable, right? Uh, anyway, like people do what they do, right?
I mean, it's you can't really do much about it at the end of the day, but at least there's something doing it. And it looks like I think it's a good thing, right? I think the steps we're seeing, like I was telling, society is changing. We also see it in health insurance, right? Health insurance is recognizing that they can reduce the number of claims if they promote a healthy style of living to their, people they're insuring. Like, hey, you have access for $25 a month to all of these different gyms or these saunas or whatever it is. And so, you're seeing this kind of transition of health is very important. But on top of that, right, the basic things we can do now, drugs are going to be the next step because you are going to need to be able to solve some of those, unique cancers, unique diseases, whatever those, because those do in a way affect our longevity. It's all kind of a pyramid that falls into life.
There's no way around it, right? Like I think this is one of the things that some people are kind of again like promoting all that, but you will not get to 150 by having a healthy lifestyle, no matter how healthy. Like I would, there's no way around it, right? Like that is just not going to happen. The only way to get to 150 is through molecular biology, and building tools that help us find drugs faster, cheaper, better, more effective. Right?
Yeah.
There's just no other way.
That being said, well, as we know, Pauling is a discovery platform, right? So what's Pauling's unique approach?
The thing that we're doing that is a little bit different is a lot of people are building tools for experts to use. And then what we're doing is we're trying to automate a lot of that work, right? So, it's the same kind of notion when you think of, if you think in context of marketing and language models, right? Some people are building tools that help you write, tweets faster, right? And what we're doing is an agent that just writes the tweet for you, right? So essentially, it's a traditional play on automation.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So essentially, once again, right back to where we started, moving things faster through the drug discovery phase, right? And essentially enabling people to move quicker.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
This
Have a
was
good one.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. We'll chat soon. Have a good one, Javier.